The Alone series has showcased many exceptionally skilled contestants. Jordan, who bow hunted a 700-pound moose, and Roland, who overpowered a musk ox with a knife, are undoubtedly the strongest. The journeys of these two champions have been discussed before. Now, let's talk about the winner of Season 8, Clay. I believe his skills surpass those of Jordan, not only because he successfully hunted large animals, but also because he had the closest encounter with a grizzly bear in the show's history. His abilities include building shelters, creating food storage systems, and implementing an efficient spear net pulley system. His archery is also remarkably accurate, making him an outstanding survival contestant. Clay has 10 years of wilderness experience, having hunted all the large animals in his home state of Idaho. He often posts related videos online. He joined the challenge to win the prize money and test his survival skills. The production team featured him from day one. Clay found a game trail on a ridge with a fork leading downward. His initial outing was meant just to explore the area without focusing on hunting any specific animal. However, his luck was good from the start. He stumbled upon a patch of morel mushrooms, securing his first food of the challenge. Originally planning to explore the surroundings, he switched to gathering mode, picking every visible morel mushroom and stuffing about 20 to 30 into his jacket. Mushrooms alone wouldn't make a substantial meal, so Clay continued wandering in the woods. Within minutes, he spotted a grouse on the ground. He immediately drew his bow and shot an arrow. Clay's archery remained steady. Almost as soon as the bowstring was released, the grouse was struck and fell. He went to the lakeside to prepare his catch, making a successful outing with enough for a delicious meal of chicken and mushroom stew. The challenge took place in the Chilko Lake area of Canada, known as Grizzly Bear Country. Clay chose not to cook at his camp to avoid attracting bears, setting up his kitchen away from his shelter to minimize danger. While waiting for his meal to cook, he turned around and nearly jumped out of his skin. 40 meters away, a cougar was staring intently at him. This animal could kill an adult male. While others might freeze in place, Clay charged at it, intending to drive the cougar up a tree and kill it. Unfortunately, the cougar did not react as expected. Clay regretted not bringing his bow and arrow, as a shot would have likely been effective. If he could have started his challenge this way, he would be remembered even if the show continued for 100 more seasons. After nightfall, a heavy rain began. Fortunately, Clay's temporary shelter was large enough to keep him dry. After the storm, as the weather improved, he began building a long-term dwelling, though it required a significant amount of energy. Before starting construction, Clay needed to secure some decent food. On the second day of the competition, he crafted a fishing rod and went to the lake before dawn to fish. He waited for a long time, and just as it was fully light, a fish bit. Clay seized the opportunity and pulled it to shore without the line breaking or the fish escaping. He successfully caught his first fish of the season, a 2-pound rainbow trout, using a bottle cap and pink umbrella cord as bait. A simple but miraculous combination. With this fish and the energy from the morels he had gathered, Clay began building his shelter. He erected an A-frame using logs, fixed a tarp as the roof and side walls, and built a large fireplace with stones. He had removed the bark from the logs above the fireplace for fireproofing and added a layer of mud for extra safety. He filled the gaps with moss. The interior was spacious and the fireplace ventilated well. It didn't take much time or effort to complete his permanent shelter. The remaining half of the rainbow trout was still uneaten. Clay used his oversized underwear in this situation. By tying the legs and hanging the remaining fish in them with a rope, he minimized the risk of animals stealing it. Aware of his lean physique, he knew he needed a substantial source of food to have a chance at winning. Although the area had signs of grizzly bears, local laws prohibited hunting them. Cougars were allowed but elusive, making hunting black-tailed or white-tailed deer more practical. Clay targeted an open brushy slope, thinking it likely to find deer there. His long trek in search of game was a gamble. A successful hunt could give him an edge, but failure could hasten his exit from the competition. Arriving at the slope, Clay was dismayed to find it was a burned forest. The downed trees made walking difficult and risky, potentially causing injuries that could affect his participation. After a full circuit without spotting any deer, he rested briefly before heading back. Along the way, he saw plenty of grizzly bear feces and territorial claw marks on trees. Suddenly, he heard a noise in the bushes nearby and spotted a grizzly bear less than 10 meters away, hiding behind the willow tree he was pointing at. Fortunately, the bear ran off, and although he didn't find any deer, he narrowly avoided a close encounter with the bear. With his food supplies low, Clay turned his attention to the berries on the ground and focused on gathering them. He collected 4 liters of blueberries. Since the weather was not yet cold, storing them directly would cause them to spoil quickly. He chose a spot by a stream in a lower-lying area where cooler air would help preserve them. Clay dug a hole on the stream side, lined it with wood planks, and separated the bottom with moss and soil to store the berries, hoping they would suffice to fill his stomach if he couldn't get meat. On day 17, Clay decided to put more effort into fishing. After several previous attempts where the fish escaped, he learned his lessons and prepared to make a scoop net using branches and the core of an umbrella cord. He also crafted a shuttle for net weaving, and his handiwork was impressive, looking almost store-bought. He chose a spot he had scouted earlier where deeper water should have increased his chances of catching fish. Unfortunately, now with a net but no bites, he stood on a rock for hours without success. Since fishing failed, Clay switched back to hunting mode, taking his bow and arrows further afield to a previously unexplored forest. Here, he finally noticed deer droppings, the first sign of deer he had seen during the challenge. It was late, and even if he shot a deer, he couldn't process and transport it back to camp before dark. To avoid startling the game, he headed back to camp, remembering the route for future hunts. The next day at noon, Clay set out fully equipped. To avoid making noise from his jacket scraping against branches, he wore a cotton shirt over it. Arriving at the spot where he had found deer droppings the day before, he discovered more fresh droppings after a whole night, confirming that this forest was a deer-active area. Clay kept his noise to a minimum and started scanning the surroundings carefully. Suddenly, he locked eyes with a male black-tailed deer. He refrained from any sudden movements to avoid startling it. When the deer looked away to continue grazing, Clay quickly put down his camera, drew an arrow, and shot it towards the deer. The shot was successful, hitting the target. Concerned that the injured deer might bolt, he cautiously approached the spot a few minutes later. He found blood on the grass and the broken arrow covered in blood. Turning around, he saw the black-tailed deer lying dead on the nearby grassland. The event happened so suddenly that he could hardly believe it was real. The deer weighed 60 kilograms. Clay let out a long shout, releasing the stress built up inside him. With bears frequenting the area, he knew he had to process the deer quickly and transport it back to camp. The task was urgent and daunting, but Clay carried the divided deer legs and rushed back to camp, 4 kilometers away, without any rest. He managed to bring all the meat back to camp by 5:30 p.m., relieving all his stress. Catching a fish could put him ahead for a day or two, but this deer, providing about 13 kilograms of pure meat, could put him ahead of other contestants for a month. Clay excitedly checked each part as dusk fell. Leaving the meat inside the shelter was unsafe, especially given the area's high bear activity. The show's producers had provided contestants with a heavy-duty rope specifically for hanging meat. Clay used this rope to hang the deer meat high up, away from the shelter. For dinner that night, he fried deer heart in deer fat, having not tasted meat for half a month. The flavor was incredibly delightful as he relished the fats and proteins, eating with exclamations of pleasure. The next day, he checked the meat hanging high up. It had attracted neither bears nor flies. Clay hurried to construct a smokehouse. He planned to build a cabin-style structure, sturdy enough with ample interior space. It wasn't guaranteed to keep out black bears, but at least he would hear any disturbance and could react to drive them away. After stacking the logs squarely and threading wire through the gaps for hanging, he covered the roof with logs and then moss. This made the subsequent processing much easier. Clay sliced all the deer meat into strips and fillets, quickly cleaning the legs. He hung the meat on the wires inside the cabin, perfectly sized to fit all the cuts. When the smoke rose, he could finally relax, knowing that by morning, the meat would be smoked and dehydrated, preserved well enough to last a month or two without spoiling. The deer's head also had a use. Clay planned to make a lure hat from the scalp, which might help him get closer to prey in the future. He carefully skinned the deer's head, scraped off the meat, fat, and cartilage to prevent rot, sewed shut the eyes and mouth, and filled it with moss, crafting a handmade lure hat. Finally, he processed the hide. Clay extracted all the deer's brain, which contains lecithin, a natural emulsifier. He mashed the brain and applied it evenly across the hide, allowing it to condition the leather. He planned to use the treated hide as a chairback once it was ready. On day 31, at 2:30 a.m., Clay was awakened by noises outside. He opened the door to look but saw nothing, guessing the intruder might have been scared off. After daylight, he searched around the camp and found bear tracks by the lake. Worried that the food storage might be targeted by bears, he walked over and indeed saw tracks in the snow, going back and forth between the food storage and the shelter. To protect the valuable deer meat, Clay tied a car horn to a tree above a steel ring, encircling the food storage area with a tripwire made from umbrella cord. If a bear hit the wire, the horn would sound, waking him up if not scaring the intruder away. The smoked deer meat was not abundant, so Clay had to ration it carefully. He could only eat a piece the size he held in his hand each day, which was not enough to provide all his energy. Therefore, he couldn't neglect obtaining other food sources and continued to fish at the lake. However, for some reason, Clay's luck with fishing had been particularly bad since catching the first fish of the season. He spent several hours without any bites and returned empty-handed from subsequent fishing attempts. He even nearly encountered a bear looking for food by the lake. Fortunately, Clay quickly climbed a tree to escape. By day 35, Clay used the deer hide as a backrest for a wooden chair. Holding the cup he made on the second day, he drank spruce tea and enjoyed the northern scenery. His peaceful moment was short-lived as he spotted a bear walking along the lake shore. When he returned to the shelter to retrieve his bow and arrows, the bear had already disappeared into the forest. Annoyed by its presence near his camp, as it could frequently return if it found food, Clay followed the bear's tracks, hoping to drive it away. While searching, he was surprised by the bear, which had moved behind a tree just 5 meters away. Luckily, Clay quickly used his bear spray, scaring it off just in time. A few seconds later could have been disastrous. After this close encounter, the bear likely wouldn't dare come near his camp again. Clay's carefully crafted scoop net had remained unused, and he lost confidence in fishing. Instead, he filled it with moss to use as a target for practicing his archery, potentially even shooting a black-tailed deer. On day 45, according to the show's rules, contestants could start using gill nets for fishing. As the weather cooled, the fish moved to the warmer, deep water. Clay constructed a tripod from logs, setting it up near the lake with a wire loop at the top and another on a pole near the lake. There was also a buoy with a loop in the lake. He attached the gill net to a long rope and ran it through the loops to form a circle, allowing him to deploy and retrieve the net from shore. Despite his well-thought-out setup, he caught nothing for 3 days, failing to meet his expectations. Meanwhile, another contestant, Colt, who had nearly starved earlier, set his net in a farther part of the lake by boat and caught 2 fish, finally enjoying a long-awaited meal. Clay, not fixated on fishing, turned to collecting matsutake mushrooms in the forest. Despite their high value, he skillfully gathered 2 to 3 pounds along a mountain ridge. On day 57, the temperature dropped further, and it took Clay 10 minutes just to get dressed each morning. The lake was choppy, and when retrieving the gill net, it seemed to snag on something underwater. He struggled to pull it up, and although he caught a rainbow trout, providing about 2,500 calories, the net was tangled beyond use. Disappointed with the poor results at that location, Clay moved his fishing setup to a new spot. Later, he returned to the forest to hunt grouse but unexpectedly found fresh cougar droppings, likely from the same one he had encountered before. Hoping to track and possibly shoot the cougar, which would be a lifetime achievement, as local laws allowed hunting cougars, Clay made a tube collar from deer hide that mimicked the distress calls of a dying rabbit, hoping to attract the cougar. The next morning before dawn, he left with his bow and arrows to set the trap. However, on his way, he saw bear tracks in the snow, the first near his camp since he had scared the bear away. The freshest tracks were only 7 meters from his shelter. Clay had to cancel his plans for hunting the cougar, as mimicking a rabbit might attract the bear, weighing 200 to 300 kilograms. Fortunately, there wasn't much deer meat left. He just needed to hang it in his underwear on a tree, no longer needing to go to great lengths to protect it. Clay's main focus now is on the gill net. He recently moved it to a new location. Since the start of the competition, his weight has decreased by 20%. He urgently needs to get fats from fish to maintain his weight, but the gill net has been extremely ineffective. Despite changing locations and setting it in deep water, He has caught only one fish in over 10 days. Each time he retrieves the net, it's tangled, requiring a lot of time and patience to untangle. Clay feels completely unproductive, and it's negatively affecting his mood. He decides it's not worth any more effort and switches to using traps and his bow and arrows instead. Clay sets up wire snares where snowshoe hares pass, marking the spots with pink umbrella cord. It's been nearly a week since he finished the deer meat, and he is constantly hungry. He wishes he had eaten the entire black-tailed deer instead of using its brain to make leather. After a night of waiting, it's time to check the traps. The good news is there are many signs of snowshoe hares in the forest. The bad news is that the first trap hasn't been triggered. It's unclear if the hares are avoiding it or slipping through. As Clay's spirits start to sink, the second trap he checks has caught a hare. He sincerely thanks God. Another trap also yields a snowshoe hare. Today's luck is surprisingly good. Although he had little confidence in the traps, he unexpectedly catches 2 hares. This boost renews his confidence in possibly winning. That evening, he cooks himself a delicious pot of rabbit stew, perfectly cooked to separate the meat from the bones yet still chewy. The meat is fresh, juicy, and not at all greasy. Starvation makes even sucking on the rabbit's eyeballs a pleasure. At 10:30 p.m., Clay hears something knocking over the scoop net outside. He quickly goes out to check and sees a fisher, a fierce predator with no natural enemies, protected by local laws from being killed. He manages to scare it away, thinking that was the end of it. However, the next morning when he checks the traps, he is stunned. He finds the fisher's tracks in the snow following his own to the traps. He realizes the fisher had checked the traps before him the previous night. Indeed, he finds a pool of blood where the fisher had taken a rabbit. Now he faces a major problem. He is powerless against the fisher, which, having gotten away with it once, will likely return nightly to steal his catches. All his efforts seem in vain. Day 71 is Thanksgiving, and Clay lies in his shelter, tears flowing before he can even speak. Struggling to survive and missing his family, he can hardly hold back the tears. He is close to pressing the button to quit the competition. On day 73, the last competing contestant, Biko, withdraws. For the past few months, he has survived on wild onions and bark soup, but his body can't take it anymore, and he quits. The production team informs Clay for health reasons. When told he is the winner and can go home, he is overwhelmed with emotion. Thus, the 8th season of Alone concludes successfully.